The snow had been falling for 3 straight days when I first noticed Max behaving strangely. He was a German Shepherd mix I'd inherited along with the farm, a loyal companion my Uncle Thomas had raised from a puppy. For nearly a week, Max had been scratching and digging at the same spot behind the old barn, his paws working frantically through layers of frozen earth and accumulated snow. His breath came out in white clouds as he dug with an intensity I'd never seen before, ignoring his food, ignoring my calls, completely consumed by whatever lay beneath that particular patch of ground. I stood on the farmhouse porch, my 3rd cup of coffee steaming in the frigid morning air, watching Max's determined excavation. The property had been in my family for generations, passed down through a line of men who'd worked this land until their backs gave out or their hearts stopped. Uncle Thomas had been the last, dying suddenly at 67 from a stroke that took him before anyone could say goodbye. He'd left everything to me, his only nephew, the one person who'd bothered to visit him during those final lonely years. The farm had a reputation in town. People whispered about it in the grocery store, at the post office, in the diner where locals gathered for breakfast. They called it cursed, haunted, touched by something dark that made crops fail and animals sicken. 3 families had tried to buy it over the years, offering Uncle Thomas generous prices for land that should have been worthless. He'd refused every offer, telling me once that some things were meant to stay in the family, no matter how heavy the burden of keeping them. Max barked sharply, a sound of triumph mixed with something that might have been urgency. He'd broken through to something, his whole body disappearing into a hole that seemed to swallow him completely. I set down my coffee and grabbed my winter coat, pulling on the insulated boots that had become essential gear since moving to this remote corner of Montana. The wind bit through my layers as I trudged across the snow-covered yard, each step sinking into drifts that came up past my knees. The hole Max had dug was impressive, easily 4 feet deep and still going. He'd hit something solid, something that wasn't frozen earth or buried rock. I could hear the scrape of his claws against metal, see the flash of something dark and rectangular emerging from the permafrost. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have said why. There was something about the way Max was acting, the desperation in his digging, that made my skin crawl despite the cold. I knelt beside the excavation, my knees sinking into wet snow, and reached down to help clear away the loose earth. The object was a metal container, roughly the size of a large toolbox, its surface covered in rust and corrosion, but still intact after what must have been decades underground. The metal was cold enough to burn my bare hands, forcing me to pull back and fish out my work gloves from my coat pocket. Uncle Thomas had never mentioned burying anything out here. In fact, he'd been adamant that I stay away from this particular area of the property, claiming the ground was unstable and dangerous. He'd said there were old mine shafts from the 1800s, places where a person could fall through and disappear forever. Now, staring at this deliberately buried container, those warnings took on a different meaning entirely. Max sat back on his haunches, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes fixed on me with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. He'd done his job, found what he'd been looking for, and now he was waiting to see what I would do about it. Dogs weren't supposed to be that purposeful, that directed in their actions, but Max had always been different, Uncle Thomas had told me. Special, he'd called him. A dog who understood things that shouldn't make sense to an animal. The container came free with effort, my muscles straining as I pulled it from the frozen earth. It weighed at least 50 pounds, dense with whatever lay inside. The surface was marked with scratches and dents, evidence of rough handling before it had been buried. But what caught my attention was the date stamped into the metal near the handle, barely visible beneath the rust. 1989. That was 36 years ago, a year before I was born, during a time when Uncle Thomas would have been in his early 30s. I carried the container to the barn, Max following close at my heels, like a guardian ensuring his discovery made it to safety. The barn's interior was warmer than outside, heated by the wood stove I kept burning through these brutal winter months. I set the container on my workbench and studied it under the harsh fluorescent lights Uncle Thomas had installed years ago. There was no lock, just a simple latch mechanism that had corroded shut over the decades. A few careful taps with a hammer, some penetrating oil worked into the joints, and the latch gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty barn. My hands hesitated on the lid. I'd been on this farm for only 8 months, still learning its rhythms and secrets, still discovering the layers of history Uncle Thomas had never bothered to explain. Opening this container felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross, learning something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Max whined softly, pressing his head against my leg in what felt like encouragement or warning. I couldn't tell which. The barn suddenly felt too quiet, too isolated. The only sounds my breathing and the creak of wind against the old wooden walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding to the drifts that had already cut us off from the nearest town 15 miles away. Whatever I was about to discover, I would be discovering it alone. Inside the container, wrapped in layers of heavy plastic that had protected the contents from moisture and decay, lay a collection of items that made my breath catch in my throat. Photographs, dozens of them, showed scenes I couldn't immediately understand. A young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, smiling at the camera with eyes that held both joy and sadness. The same woman in different settings, different seasons, always alone, always with that same haunted expression. And beneath the photographs, journals filled with handwriting I recognized immediately as Uncle Thomas's, though the words were written by a younger version of the man I'd known. I spread the photographs across my workbench, arranging them chronologically by the dates written on the backs. They spanned a period of about 3 years, from 1986 to 1989, documenting what appeared to be a relationship Uncle Thomas had never mentioned to anyone. The woman's name was written on several of the photos, Elena Winters. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that transformed her entire face when it was genuine. The journals told a story I wasn't prepared to read. Uncle Thomas had met Elena in town, at the library where she worked as an assistant librarian. She'd been new to the area, having moved from Seattle to escape something she wouldn't talk about, something that made her flinch at loud noises and check over her shoulder constantly. They'd fallen in love quickly, the kind of intense connection that happens when two lonely people find each other in an isolated place. But the entries grew darker as the months progressed. Elena had been running from an abusive ex-husband, a man named David Winters, who refused to accept their divorce. Uncle Thomas wrote about threatening phone calls, about a car that followed Elena home from work, about broken windows and poisoned livestock that he'd attributed to David's harassment. The local sheriff had been useless, Uncle Thomas wrote with bitterness that still felt fresh on the page. Small-town law enforcement didn't take domestic violence seriously back then, especially when it involved outsiders and complicated jurisdictions. The final journal entry was dated December 3rd, 1989. Elena had disappeared the night before, vanishing from the farm where she'd been staying with Uncle Thomas for safety. Her car was found 3 days later, submerged in Lake Kootenai 20 miles north, with Elena's body still inside. The sheriff ruled it an accident, claiming she'd lost control on the icy roads and crashed through the guardrail. But Uncle Thomas's writing told a different story. He'd seen David Winters in town that week, had confronted him about Elena's death, had been threatened in return. Beneath the journals lay something that made my hands shake as I lifted it carefully from the container. A manila envelope, sealed and labeled in Uncle Thomas's handwriting, evidence the sheriff refused to see. Inside were photographs of tire tracks in the snow near where Elena's car had left the road, tracks that showed another vehicle had been present, witness statements from people who'd seen David Winters' truck in the area that night. A mechanic's report showing Elena's car had been maintained perfectly, making mechanical failure unlikely. And most damning, a series of photographs showing damage to David Winters' truck that was consistent with a collision, damage that appeared days after Elena's death. Uncle Thomas had built a case that any competent investigator should have pursued. But the sheriff had closed the investigation, ruled Elena's death accidental, and threatened Uncle Thomas with charges of harassment when he'd tried to push for further inquiry. The final item in the envelope was a letter from the State Attorney General's office, dated 6 months after Eleanor's death, declining to reopen the investigation due to insufficient evidence and the sheriff's determination that the case was closed. I sat down heavily on my work stool, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on my shoulders like the snow accumulating outside. Uncle Thomas had spent the last 36 years of his life knowing that the woman he'd loved had been murdered, knowing who was responsible and being powerless to do anything about it. He'd buried this evidence not to hide it, but to preserve it, waiting for a time when it might matter again, when justice might finally be possible. Max sat beside me, his head resting on my knee, his dark eyes watching my face as if he understood the gravity of what we'd uncovered. Uncle Thomas had trained him, raised him, and apparently had given him a mission that extended beyond his own death. Find the evidence. Make sure someone discovered the truth. Dogs lived in the present, but Max had been carrying the weight of the past, waiting for the right moment to reveal what his master had hidden. I pulled out my phone, checking for signal, even though I knew the snowstorm had knocked out cell service 2 days ago. The landline in the house was my only connection to the outside world, and even that was unreliable during storms like this. But I needed to contact someone, needed to figure out what to do with this evidence that had been buried for over 3 decades. The question was whether it even mattered anymore. David Winters would be in his 60s or 70s now, possibly dead himself. The sheriff who'd closed the investigation had retired years ago. The witnesses might have moved away or passed on. Could justice still be served after so much time had passed? Or would I be digging up pain and trauma for nothing more than symbolic vindication? But as I looked at Elena's photographs, at her smile and her sad eyes, I knew I couldn't just rebury this evidence and pretend I'd never found it. Uncle Thomas had preserved it for a reason. He'd waited 36 years for someone to discover it, trained his dog to find it when he was gone. This was more than evidence. It was a legacy, a final request from a man who'd lived with injustice eating away at his soul until the day he died. If this story has gripped you the way it's gripping me, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. Every story I share here is about uncovering truths that deserve to be told, about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. And speaking of truth, I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed how you understood your family's history? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us process them, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something almost otherworldly. Snow had drifted against the barn in waves that reached halfway up the walls, and the road leading to town was completely impassable without heavy equipment. I spent the morning digging out paths between the buildings, my mind churning through possibilities, while my body went through the familiar motions of farm work. Max stayed close, as if sensing that his discovery had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. By afternoon, I'd managed to clear enough snow to reach the house and get the landline working. My first call was to the county records office, where a bored-sounding clerk helped me locate information about Elena Winters' death. The case file was archived, she told me, available for review by appointment only. When I mentioned I had new evidence, her tone shifted from boredom to cautious interest. She transferred me to someone in the sheriff's department, a detective named Sarah Chen, who specialized in cold cases. Detective Chen listened to my story with the kind of patient attention that made me think she'd heard plenty of strange tales from people claiming to have solved decades-old mysteries. But when I described the contents of the container, the photographs of tire tracks and vehicle damage, her questions became sharper and more focused. She'd heard of Elena Winters' case, she told me. It had come up during a review of unsolved deaths from the 1980s, part of a statewide initiative to re-examine cases where domestic violence might have been a factor. What I didn't know, what Uncle Thomas couldn't have known when he buried his evidence, was that David Winters had gone on to kill again. 2 more women over the following decades, both ex-partners, both deaths initially ruled accidental before being reclassified as homicides. He was currently serving life in prison for the murder of his 3rd wife, a woman named Patricia Kendall, who died in a house fire in 2008. Investigators had finally established a pattern, finally connected the dots between multiple suspicious deaths, but Eleanor Winters's case had remained officially classified as an accident because there hadn't been enough evidence to prove otherwise, until now. Detective Chen explained that new evidence in old cases could sometimes lead to additional charges, especially when it established pattern behavior and contradicted official findings. If Uncle Thomas's photographs and documentation were as comprehensive as I described, they could potentially add another murder charge to David Winters's life sentence. More importantly, they could give Eleanor's family closure, proof that she hadn't simply lost control of her car on an icy road, but had been deliberately killed by a man who'd been stalking her. Did Eleanor have family? I asked, thinking of those photographs, that smile, those haunted eyes. A sister, Detective Chen told me, Amanda Winters, now Amanda Morrison, living in Spokane. She'd been 17 when Elena died, had spent 36 years believing her sister's death was a tragic accident. Learning the truth would be painful, but Chen suspected Amanda already had doubts. Victims' families often did, especially in cases involving abusers who'd been known to law enforcement. We arranged for me to bring the evidence to the sheriff's department as soon as the roads were passable. Chen warned me to keep everything secure, not to mention the discovery to anyone else, until the investigation was officially reopened. People who'd been involved in the original case might not appreciate having their decisions questioned, she said carefully. Small-town politics being what they were, there could be complications I wasn't prepared to handle. After hanging up, I sat at Uncle Thomas's old kitchen table, surrounded by the accumulation of his solitary life. Newspaper clippings about Elena's death, carefully preserved in a scrapbook he'd hidden in his bedroom closet. Letters he'd written, but never sent to the State Attorney General, to the FBI, to anyone who might listen to his claims about murder and cover-up. He'd been desperate for justice, desperate to make someone pay attention, but he'd been one man against a system that didn't want to admit it had failed. The farm's reputation suddenly made more sense. Uncle Thomas hadn't been cursed or haunted by supernatural forces. He'd been consumed by grief and rage, letting the property deteriorate while he obsessed over Elena's death. The failed crops and sick animals hadn't been the result of bad luck, but of neglect from a man too broken to properly care for anything, including himself. People had sensed the darkness here because Uncle Thomas had been radiating it for decades, unable to move past the injustice that had destroyed his chance at happiness. I found photographs of them together, hidden in the same closet where the scrapbook had been kept. They showed a version of Uncle Thomas I'd never seen, younger and lighter, smiling with genuine joy, as he stood next to Eleanor in front of this very farmhouse. She'd been feeding chickens in one photo, laughing as they clustered around her feet. In another, they were building a snowman, both of them covered in snow and grinning like children. These were the moments Uncle Thomas had buried along with his evidence, memories too painful to display, but too precious to destroy. Max appeared in several of the more recent photos, a puppy held in Elena's arms, her face pressed against his soft fur. She'd been there when Uncle Thomas got him, had helped name him, had loved him as much as she'd loved the man who'd tried to protect her. Max wasn't just a dog who'd been trained to find buried evidence. He was a living connection to Elena, the last creature who'd known her touch, who carried some fragment of her presence into the present. I wondered if dogs remembered people the way humans did, If Max had some ancestral memory passed down from his mother or grandmother, some genetic echo of Elena's kindness, it seemed impossible, but then so did everything else about this situation. A dog digging up evidence of a 36-year-old murder, a case that could still be prosecuted, a family that could finally have answers. It felt less like coincidence and more like something orchestrated from beyond, as if Elena herself had reached across the years to make sure the truth finally emerged. The evening light was fading when I made my second call, this one to Amanda Morrison in Spokane. Detective Chen had given me her number, suggesting that hearing the news from me might be gentler than getting it from law enforcement. Amanda answered on the third ring, her voice cautious, clearly wondering who was calling from a Montana area code she didn't recognize. Telling Amanda Morrison that her sister had been murdered was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. She listened in silence as I explained who I was, how I'd inherited the farm, what Max had uncovered. When I finished, there was a long pause filled only with the sound of her breathing, steady but strained, as if she was fighting to maintain control. "I always knew," she finally said, her voice breaking. "Everyone told me I was being paranoid, that I needed to accept it was an accident and move on. But I knew David had done something. Elena was terrified of him, and she was the most careful driver I'd ever known. She wouldn't have lost control on that road, not unless someone forced her off." Amanda started crying then, not the desperate sobs of fresh grief, but the exhausted tears of someone who'd been carrying a burden for far too long. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not letting this stay buried." We talked for over an hour, Amanda sharing memories of Elena that brought the woman in the photographs to life. She'd been a passionate reader, Amanda told me, someone who'd dreamed of opening her own bookstore someday. She'd loved animals, especially dogs, and had volunteered at shelters whenever she could. She'd been kind and gentle, the type of person who saw the best in everyone, which was probably why she'd married David Winters in the first place, before his true nature revealed itself. Amanda had been living with their parents when Elena died, had watched them deteriorate under the weight of losing their oldest daughter. Their mother had passed away in 1995, their father in 2003, both of them having gone to their graves believing Eleanor's death was a senseless accident. "At least they're not here to relive this," Amanda said quietly. "But I'm glad I am. I'm glad I get to see David finally held accountable for what he did to my sister." She asked about Uncle Thomas, about what kind of man he'd been. I told her the truth, that he'd been lonely and broken, that losing Elena had hollowed him out in ways he'd never recovered from. But I also told her about the evidence he'd preserved, about his decades-long quest for justice, about how he'd apparently trained Max to find what he'd buried when the time was right. "He never stopped loving her," I said. "He spent the rest of his life trying to make sure she got justice, even if he didn't live to see it happen." Amanda was quiet for a moment, then asked if she could come to the farm once the investigation was complete, if she could see where Elena had spent her final happy months. "Of course," I told her. The farmhouse still held traces of Elena's presence, things Uncle Thomas had kept like sacred relics, a coffee mug she'd favored, a sweater she'd left hanging in the closet, books with her name written inside the covers. I'd thought they were just the random possessions of someone long dead, but now I understood they were monuments to a love that had been cut short by violence. After we said goodbye, I sat in the gathering darkness of Uncle Thomas's kitchen, Max's head resting on my feet, and thought about the weight of secrets. Uncle Thomas had carried Elena's death alone for 36 years, unable to share his pain with anyone because doing so meant admitting he'd failed to protect her, meant facing the indifference of a system that hadn't cared enough to investigate properly. He'd become isolated and bitter, his farm deteriorating into a reflection of his internal landscape, all because one corrupt or lazy sheriff had decided that pursuing the truth wasn't worth the effort. The next morning, a county plow finally cleared the road, and I drove into town with the evidence container secured in my truck bed. Detective Chen met me at the sheriff's department. a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence. She examined the contents of the container with meticulous care, photographing every item, cataloguing every piece of documentation, treating Uncle Thomas's evidence with the respect it had been denied 36 years earlier. "This is extraordinary," she said after an hour of review. "Your uncle essentially conducted a complete criminal investigation on his own. These photographs of the tire tracks, the damage patterns on Winters's vehicle, the witness statements, any competent detective should have pursued this. The fact that it was ignored speaks to either incompetence or something worse." She looked up at me, her expression grim. "The sheriff who closed this case, Frank Patterson, he's still alive. Retired to Arizona about 10 years ago. I'm going to need to interview him about his decision-making process." And there was an implication in her words that I hadn't considered. What if the investigation hadn't just been incompetent? What if it had been deliberately suppressed? David Winters had family connections in the area, Uncle Thomas had written in one of his journals. His father had been a county commissioner, his uncle a state representative. It wasn't impossible that pressure had been applied to close the case quickly, to avoid the scandal of a prominent family's son being investigated for murder. Detective Chen saw the realization crossing my face and nodded slightly. Cold cases have a way of revealing uncomfortable truths about how justice was administered in the past. Not everyone is going to be happy about this investigation being reopened, especially if it exposes corruption or favoritism. You should be prepared for pushback, possibly from people in positions of authority." She paused, then added, "Your uncle was a brave man to document all of this. He must have known he was making himself a target by gathering evidence against someone with powerful connections." That thought had occurred to me as well. Uncle Thomas's isolation on the farm, his reputation as a difficult and paranoid man, might have been partly self-imposed, but also partly engineered. If people thought he was unstable or obsessed, they wouldn't take his accusations seriously. It was a perfect way to neutralize a witness without having to resort to more direct methods. David Winters hadn't needed to kill Uncle Thomas because he'd already destroyed his credibility. I spent the rest of the day giving a formal statement, walking Detective Chen through everything from Max's initial discovery to my conversations with Amanda Morrison. She recorded every word, treated my testimony with the same seriousness she'd given Uncle Thomas's evidence. This was going to be a major case, she told me. The State Attorney General's office was already interested, and there was talk of conducting a broader review of cases from that era to see if other investigations had been improperly closed. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, the State Attorney General announced that Elena Winters' death was being reclassified as a homicide, and that additional charges would be filed against David Winters. The news made regional headlines, sparking conversations about how domestic violence cases had been mishandled in the past, and how many other victims might have been failed by systems that should have protected them. Former Sheriff Frank Patterson gave an interview claiming he'd conducted a thorough investigation and that the evidence had simply pointed to an accident. But when reporters pressed him about the tire tracks and vehicle damage documented in Uncle Thomas's photographs, Patterson became defensive and eventually stopped taking calls. Detective Chen told me privately that inconsistencies were emerging in his case files from that era, suggesting a pattern of closed investigations involving powerful families. The state was now looking at dozens of cases Patterson had handled, searching for other instances where justice might have been compromised. David Winters' attorney tried to argue that the new evidence was inadmissible, that too much time had passed, that Uncle Thomas's documentation was unreliable. But forensic experts confirmed that the photographs were authentic and that the tire track patterns were consistent with a vehicle forcing another car off the road. Witness statements Uncle Thomas had collected corroborated the timeline and placed Winters at the scene. The case against him was circumstantial but compelling, and combined with his subsequent murders, it painted a picture of a serial abuser who'd been getting away with violence for decades. Amanda Morrison came to visit the farm in early spring, when the snow had finally melted and the land was beginning to show signs of life. She brought flowers for Elena, and we walked together to the spot where Uncle Thomas had proposed to her sister, a meadow overlooking the valley where wildflowers were just starting to bloom. Amanda cried as she placed the flowers on the ground, talking to Elena as if she could hear, telling her that justice was finally coming, that she hadn't been forgotten. We spent the afternoon going through Elena's belongings, the items Uncle Thomas had preserved all these years. Amanda took the coffee mug, the books and several photographs, but she insisted I keep the sweater. "Elena would want you to have something of hers," she said. "Your uncle loved her, and she loved him. You're part of that story now, part of keeping their memory alive." She hugged me tightly before she left, thanking me again for not letting the truth stay buried, for honoring Uncle Thomas's decades-long quest for justice. The farm began to feel different after that, as if some weight had been lifted from the land itself. I started making improvements Uncle Thomas had neglected, repairing fences and outbuildings, planting crops that actually grew instead of withering in cursed soil. Neighbors who'd avoided the property for years started stopping by, curious about the changes, willing to admit they'd always suspected something tragic had happened here, but hadn't known what. Max stayed close through all of it, his mission complete, but his loyalty unwavering. He was getting older now, grey creeping into his muzzle, his movements slower than they'd been when I first arrived. But his eyes remained sharp and knowing, and I often caught him staring at the meadow, where we'd spread Elena's flowers, as if he could see something there I couldn't. Maybe he could. Maybe dogs understood things about life and death and justice that humans were too limited to grasp. The trial was scheduled for the following autumn. David Winters would face charges for Elena's murder in addition to his existing convictions, ensuring he would never leave prison alive. It wasn't the immediate justice Uncle Thomas had wanted 36 years ago, but it was justice nonetheless. Elena's name would be cleared, her death properly classified, her memory honored by a legal system that had initially failed her, but was now trying to make amends. I thought about Uncle Thomas often during those months, wondering if he'd somehow known that burying the evidence would eventually lead to its discovery. He couldn't have predicted that I would inherit the farm, or that Max would dig in exactly the right spot. But maybe he'd had faith that truth had a way of surfacing when the time was right, that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. Detective Chen told me that cold cases were being solved with increasing frequency as new technologies and changed attitudes allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence. Uncle Thomas's documentation had been ahead of its time, thorough enough to meet modern forensic standards, even though it had been gathered with simple cameras and manual record-keeping. He'd been a better detective than the people paid to do the job, driven by love and grief to uncover truths that others had been too lazy or corrupt to pursue. The farm became my home in a way I hadn't expected. I'd arrived here planning to sell it as soon as possible, to escape the isolation and the whispered reputation that made neighbors cross the street rather than talk to me. But discovering Elena's story, helping to bring her justice, had connected me to this place in ways that went beyond property ownership. This land had witnessed love and loss, had held secrets that needed to be revealed, and had finally given up its truth when the time was right. Max passed away peacefully 2 years after his discovery, having lived to see David Winters convicted of Elena's murder. I buried him in the meadow next to Elena's flowers, marking his grave with a stone that read, "Good boy, faithful friend, truth seeker." He'd done what Uncle Thomas had trained him to do, had waited patiently for the right moment, had refused to let an injustice remain hidden. In his own way, he'd been as much a detective as any human investigator, following instincts that led to justice. Amanda Morrison visits every year on the anniversary of Elena's death, bringing flowers and spending quiet hours in the meadow. We've become close, bound together by a shared history neither of us expected to inherit. She tells me stories about Elena, keeping her sister's memory alive through words and laughter, ensuring that she's remembered for how she lived rather than how she died. The farmhouse is warm now, filled with light and life instead of shadows and secrets. I've added photographs to the walls, including several of Uncle Thomas and Elena together, reminders that love persists even when the people who felt it are gone. The land produces good crops, the animals thrive, and the whispers in town have changed from warnings about curses to admiration for the justice that was finally served. I learned from this experience that some secrets demand to be revealed, that truth has weight and momentum that can't be permanently suppressed. Uncle Thomas spent 36 years waiting for someone to find what he'd buried, and a loyal dog made sure that discovery happened when it mattered most. It felt less like coincidence and more like divine intervention, a sign from above that justice, though delayed, would ultimately prevail. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. Every subscription tells me that these stories matter, that truth and justice are worth fighting for, even when the fight takes decades. This community we're building together is about more than just listening to stories. It's about remembering that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they refuse to let injustice stand. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever inherited something that changed your understanding of your family? Have you discovered truths that were difficult but necessary to uncover? Share your stories with us. This community is a safe space for people to connect over experiences that shape us, challenge us, and ultimately make us stronger. And here's what I really want to know. What did you learn from Uncle Thomas and Elena's story? Was it about persistence, about love that endures beyond death, about the importance of never giving up on justice? Whatever lesson this story taught you, I'd love to hear it. Sometimes putting these insights into words helps us understand them more deeply, and your perspective might be exactly what someone else in our community needs to hear today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing, as I do, that the truth always finds a way to surface when the time is right.